The first thing I confirmed was that the instruments had not failed. That was the assumption I walked in with, the comfortable one, the one the safety office wanted me to validate so they could close the file and go home. 3 Vaethari survey operators down inside 200 seconds of the breach event, all biometrics consistent with compound 7 inhalation at class IV concentrations. Textbook. Expected. The zone had been reclassified uninhabitable within 6 minutes of the alarm. Evacuation logged complete at 7. Every living Vaethari personnel out of the breach perimeter. Every piece of telemetry showing exactly what the literature said it would show. Except for one data thread. Human survey operator Calloway, senior grade. Her biometric feed had continued transmitting from inside the zone for 5 hours and 53 minutes after the reclassification. Active movement, stable pulse, elevated but controlled, core temperature climbing and then leveling, respiratory rate up, and then at the 5-hour 53-minute mark, a clean, unpressured exit through the northern corridor on foot at survey pace, carrying a core sample case. I asked the safety officer if she had been wearing sealed external filtration. He said she had been wearing standard survey mesh, same as the 3 who collapsed. I asked him to say that again. He did. I pulled the full instrument log before I said anything else. I spent 40 minutes with the raw feed, the calibration timestamps, the redundancy checks. The instruments had not failed. The instruments had been working perfectly, which was the problem, because they had recorded 6 hours of a human being present in a class IV atmospheric breach zone and emerging on her own legs, and the only explanation for that was a physiological one, and the physiology literature did not contain it. My report to the review panel was due in 72 hours. I had considerably more work to do. Compound 7 is a sulfurous polymer chain, a byproduct of the deep seam extraction process that accumulates in unventilated survey corridors when a pressure seal fails. For Vaethari physiology, it is acutely lethal at concentrations above 2.4 parts per million. At 4 parts per million, the measured concentration in the breach zone at the time of the incident, 3 of our operators reached incapacitation within 3 minutes and critical organ involvement within 7. The 2 who survived did so because they were closest to the corridor exit and were carried out by colleagues. The 3rd required 6 days of respiratory support. At 4 parts per million, our models predicted 0 survival past 12 minutes for any catalog species on the joint colony roster. We had 31 species represented at Palin Reach. The model was built from their combined physiological data. It was not a thin model. It had been validated across 9 separate industrial incidents over a period of 20 years, and it had never been wrong by more than a rounding error. I ran Calloway's biometric feed against the exposure model at 2:30 in the morning, alone in the instrument review room. The model returned an error code I had never seen before, input values outside calculable range. I expanded the ceiling parameter and ran it again. The survival probability it returned at the 2-hour mark was 0.003%. At the 6-hour mark, it returned a notation flag the system reserved for values it classified as non-physical. Then I pulled Calloway's liver enzyme profile from her pre-deployment medical intake. In Vaethari biology, compound 7 binds irreversibly to the 2nd stage respiratory membrane. There is no enzymatic pathway that breaks it. It accumulates, and the accumulation kills. In Calloway's profile, I found 3 hepatic enzymes with no entry in the Vaethari joint species biological database. I cross-checked the Continuance Institute's extended registry, which covered 419 catalog species. The enzymes were not there. I filed a data query with the Continuance Institute's Xenobiology Division at 3:47 in the morning and wrote the preliminary report without waiting for their reply. What I could reconstruct from Calloway's biometric feed, the enzyme profile, and the exposure log was this: Compound 7 had entered her respiratory system at concentrations consistent with the other 3 operators. Her respiratory rate had climbed sharply in the first 12 minutes distress response, consistent with irritant exposure. And then the rate had leveled. Not dropped, leveled, at an elevated but sustained plateau. Her core temperature had risen 2 degrees over the first hour, then stabilized. Her cardiovascular output had increased and held. The compound was not accumulating in her system the way it accumulated in ours. Something in her hepatic cascade was breaking the polymer chain. Not completely, not cleanly. Her distress markers confirmed real exposure, real physiological cost, but enough. Enough to keep the tissue damage below the threshold of organ involvement. Enough to buy minutes, and then hours, while her body ran a slow, continuous metabolic accounting against a compound our literature classified as non-metabolizable. She had not known she was doing it. That was the part I kept returning to in the review chamber the next afternoon, sitting in front of the panel of 3 physiologists and the Joint Command Safety Officer, trying to explain what I had found. She had felt unwell. She had noted it in her field log, a headache at the 30-minute mark, some tightness in the chest. She had rated her own functional status as reduced but acceptable and had continued the survey. She had collected 18 core samples. She had documented 2 structural anomalies in the eastern corridor that the evacuation had left unlogged. She had exited the zone when her sample case was full. One of the physiologists asked me to confirm that she had not at any point lost consciousness. I confirmed it. He asked if her field log indicated she had recognized the danger of her situation. I said the field log indicated she had recognized the discomfort. The safety officer asked what the distinction was. I said I believed the distinction was this. For Operator Calloway, the physiological cost of the exposure had registered as discomfort. The gap between discomfort and danger was, in her body's accounting, very much wider than it was in ours. The panel sat quietly with that. I presented the enzyme data last. The 3 physiologists looked at the cross-reference for a long time. The senior one asked if I had confirmed the database check. I said I had run it against 419 species. He asked if the Institute's Xenobiology division had responded. I said they had forwarded the query to a specialist. He nodded slowly. The way you nod when you already know that the specialist is not going to resolve the problem, only formally confirm it. We had Operator Calloway brought in for the verbal debrief at the end of the session. She was a compact woman, mid-30s by human reckoning, with the particular quality I had started to notice in certain humans, a settled stillness that was not indifference, the look of someone who had made their accounting with the physical world and found the terms acceptable. She sat down without ceremony. I walked her through the timeline. I asked her to describe her experience in the zone in her own words. She said it had been a rough 6 hours. I asked her to be more specific. She said the headache had been significant by the 2nd hour, the chest tightness had become uncomfortable by the 4th, and her eyes had been watering badly by the 5th. She said she had thought about calling for pickup, but the sample case had been 3/4 full, and it had seemed wasteful to come back for a second run when she could finish the first. One of the physiologists exhaled slowly through his secondary vent. He did it quietly, but I heard it. I asked Calloway if there was anything she wished to add. She asked when the zone would be cleared for re-entry. I told her that determination was still pending. She nodded and said that was fine. She had the sample documentation to finish anyway, and she thanked us for our time and left. The safety officer watched the door close behind her. Then he looked at me and said, very quietly, that he wanted the panel's assessment in writing before end of shift. I told him I would have it ready. I filed the report that evening. I recommended a new physiological classification entry be opened in the Joint Species Database for human hepatic metabolization of halogenated polymer compounds. I recommended the zone exposure limits for human personnel be reviewed under a separate modeling framework with expanded ceiling parameters. I recommended that no future incident model use Vaethari baseline physiology as the upper bound survival reference for any environment where human personnel might be present. The Continuance Institute xenobiology specialist responded 4 days later. One paragraph. She confirmed the enzymes had no prior catalog entry. Preliminary consensus was that the pathway appeared to be a hepatic adaptation to long-term environmental toxin exposure, possibly spanning many generations of the human species. I read that line twice. The advisory register entry I submitted noted that the incident at Palin Reach had identified a human physiological capability outside the parameters of existing joint species safety modeling, and that the implications for multi-species operational planning were under review. That was accurate. What the register did not require me to note was the thing I had been sitting with since 3:47 in the morning. That Operator Calloway had walked into a space we classified as lethal to all known life, finished her work at survey pace, and walked out carrying 18 core samples, because her body had spent 6 hours quietly dismantling a compound we had no mechanism to touch. She had rated her own functional status as reduced but acceptable. I do not expect to stop thinking about that.